Hi, thank you for joining me. I am Dorina Kopp. I am the head of the Ancient Human Remains Program for the state of Utah within SHPO. And what we do in our program is anytime human remains are inadvertently discovered, whether that's through construction or some sort of development or even just erosion, we will respond and help the landowner or the local municipality recover those remains and analyze them and ensure that they're put through the proper process, whether that's NAGPRA, if they're Native American remains, or if it is Anglo remains or non-Native American remains to ensure that they're appropriately taken care of. Today, I'm going to talk about a continuation of some research that we presented last week to you with Megan Banton on last Thursday about some human remains that were inadvertently discovered at the University of Utah and were ultimately determined to be anatomical cadaver remains. So my presentation today is called Vital Records, the Demography of an Early 20th Century Medical School Anatomical Cadaver Collection. And today what we're going to talk about is what we learned from looking at those bones about the people that those bones belonged to. And also what we can learn from looking at the some death certificates that we have. So I would like to begin by saying that this presentation will show photographs of skeletal human remains. This is done out of respect for these individuals and so that we are all able to learn from them. So first, let's start with a little bit of background for you. As I said, these remains were found as part of construction at the George Thomas Building on President's Circle at the University of Utah in 2016. They were remodeling the building, and these were found basically underneath the building. And as Megan described last week, we determined that they were a 20th century anatomical cadaver collection from the very first years of the medical school, and they dated to about 1905 to 1930. An additional very interesting piece of information is that in 1907, the Utah State Legislature passed Senate Bill 18, which allowed for unclaimed bodies to be used by the University of Utah School of Medicine for instruction. Now, that's a pretty common thing to have unclaimed bodies and to have laws that unclaimed bodies can be used for anatomical instruction. What this resulted in that was very neat for us is that on those death certificates of those individuals, the place of disposition or the place of burial was listed as the University of Utah School of Medicine. Therefore, we could go back through the death certificates and find all the individual that went up to the University of Utah and actually have a little bit more information on the individuals and the types of individuals that they were using as medical school cadavers. And so we're going to talk about that today. First, let's talk about the bones. Megan described how we decided they were anatomical specimens. I'm going to go a little bit further into detail. So in all, we had over 1,000 bone and bone fragments. These bones were discovered by heavy excavation equipment, so a lot of them were very, very highly fragmented. But we did have some complete bones. And in archaeology and in skeletal analysis, when we have a large collection of mixed up or what we call commingled bones, we try to estimate what we call an MNI, which is a minimum number of individuals. And the MNI for this group of bones was 11 based on the right proximal femur. So that's the upper part of your upper thigh bone. And the way we do it is we identify all the bone fragments that we can to the side and to the part of the bone they're from. And then the one that we have the most of, we know that we have to have at least that many individuals. So we had 11 right upper femurs. And so we know that everyone has one right femur and one right upper femur. So we know if we have 11 of those, we have at least 11 people. Like I said, we know they're anatomical specimens that had been dissected as part of an anatomy class. Megan described this in detail. If you missed last week's talk, you can go back and watch it if you want to know more about how we figured that out. We also know that the remains were buried fleshed and as parts, not whole cadavers, that they had been sectioned based on the variable numbers of bones we have, and also based on the taphonomy or the appearance of the bones and how they decomposed. We know that as well. Okay, so let's talk about what we learned from looking at these bones. So first, when we look at bones, we estimate what we call a biological profile, where we estimate age at death, sex, ancestry, stature, and identify any trauma or disease or pathology that we see on the bones. So for these remains, interestingly, when we estimated sex, all of the ones for which we could estimate sex for, the ones that were not so fragmented that we were unable to estimate sex, but the ones we could, all of them were estimated to be male or probable male. There were 37% of the fragments that we were not able to have a good estimation on, mostly because they were so fragmented. They were such small fragments. But we had no clearly identifiable female remains. We had no remains that we said, yes, absolutely, or even possibly these are female. And so that was very interesting. No female remains. Next, when we estimated age at death, again, because they were so highly fragmented, there was a large group of remains that we were only able to say, yes, these are adult remains, or these are child remains. So we have a large group, 44% of the fragments, we were only able to say they're an adult. But again, of the ones that we were able to estimate age on, we had some pretty unique breakdown. So of all the total remains, we were able to estimate on the other percentage, and 27% of those were what we call younger adult, 23 to 45 years old. 19% of those were older adult, over 46 years of age. 5% were what we would call a subadult or skeletally immature individual, and that would be 15 to 22 years of age. And then there were 6% that they were so highly fragmented and so small that we just weren't able to tell, were they the subadult or were they an adult? So we did have that small amount also. But interesting, there were subadult remains. There was at least one, if not more, individuals that were a middle teen to early 20s. So they were still growing skeletally, and we'll talk about that right now, how we figured that out. So this is one of the individuals. This is an innominate, a hip bone. It's also called an oscoxa of an individual. And if you look at this upper corner section that I have highlighted, you'll see right here that line. And that line is where a growth plate would be during life. So this individual is still growing and it has not fused yet. That's why you can see the line. And so the fact that that's there and that it has not fused yet lets me know that this person was 17 to 22 years old. Now, it's a little hard to tell from this photograph, but based on the morphology, the size and shape and orientation of this bone, I know that this person was male. Hip bones are one of the best things we have to estimate sex from. So this person was very clearly male and a 17 to 22-year-old male. We also found a lot of other very interesting things on these remains. We found a lot of, when we looked for trauma, a lot of what we call antemortem trauma. Now, antemortem means it happened well before the person died, and it has been healed or is healing at the time they die. So we know it happens during their life when they're alive. Now, this is a hand bone. Normally, there would be a thumb bone that comes right here. But I didn't put it on there because it was a little more awkward. But if you notice this hand bone, you notice up here, in the two middle fingers, and then down in the middle part of the palm, there is some deformation and some missing bone. So if you look closely up at the ends of those two middle fingers, you'll see that they're missing bone. We have a very well-healed fracture right here and a well-healed fracture right here. This is missing just the very tip of the finger, and this is missing the very last joint and a little bit more of this finger. So these have been broken off or cut off sometime well before the person died. Similarly, if you go down and you look at his palm, you'll notice this is right in the palm of the hand. These two bones right here are kind of zigzagged and not straight. They're deformed. These were complete fractures of these bones of the palm that, again, healed, very well healed, healed deformed. And then you'll also notice down here, these bones, they kind of look like they're all melted together. And again, that was a very bad crushing fracture that resulted in these bones healing, but healing fused together. So this lets me know that this individual had some very severe accident or trauma to this hand. This is something that I would expect to see in a hand getting stuck in a large piece of machinery and getting crushed, or getting crushed between like two large train cars, or something very heavy, getting really mangled and broken and crushed. So this gives me a little clue about the activities this person was doing. They were doing something that led to this sort um, of trauma and damage to their hand. We have other antemortem fractures as well. This is a ulna, which is one of the bones of your forearm. And you'll notice right here it has a very large, deformed bulbous callus is what we call it. That's when a fracture is healing. And if you look at it closely, you'll see that it wasn't completely healed. It was still healing when this person died. So this happened still before the person died, but not as long before their death as that hand fracture. These are two different people, but it probably happened a few months before this person died. And when we see this type of fracture on the forearm like that, it based on studies and modern statistics, we know that these type of fractures happen usually in a couple different ways. One of the primary ways is when someone's blocking a blow, holding their hands up or their arms up over their face to block a blow. And another very common way is when somebody's falling or tripping or pushed or something, and they try to catch themselves on the ground, and they put their arms out and they break their arms that way. So again, it gives us a little bit of a clue as to the type of activities or situations this person might have been in before they died. In fact, when we look at the statistics for the antemortem fractures of these remains, we have some pretty high percentages. The ulnas, as I just showed you, over 33%, a third of the ulnas had these fractures. Our hands, over 15% of the hand bones that we had fractures. Our fibulas, the fibulas are the thin little lower leg bone that you have. Again, over 20% of those were fractured. We had some innominate fractures. We had cranial fractures. Rib fractures were actually pretty low, but we had a lot of antemortem fractures on these people. This lets me know that these were not sedentary people sitting at home playing video games all day. They were out there doing physical things with their body. Another thing that helps me know that these were people out there doing physical activity, somewhat probably really heavy loads of physical activity, is we can look at the arthritis or the osteoarthritis or degenerative joint disease that we have in the body. And this is the clavicle, which is your collarbone. And your collarbone gets a lot of movement because every time you move your arm around, it moves. So this is the part that articulates with your shoulder, and this is the part that articulates with your sternum right here. And this individual has very severe, right here on this shoulder end, very, very severe arthritis. We've got all these weird little bony growths and bumps and porosity, and we have a really, really large bit of new bone growth and porosity right here. This lets me know that this person probably had some severe shoulder arthritis, possibly rotator cuff, and also was using their arms a lot, so much that we have this extensive osteoarthritis on this clavicle and this collarbone. Again, here's an ulna, and if you look at this ulna, you see this kind of rigid bone right here. We call this lipping or osteophyte development. And again, this lets me know that this individual, this is a moderate to severe osteoarthritis that we have on this person right here. And again, it lets me know they're doing something with their joints, with their arms, that it's putting stress on this elbow joint, and it's causing this these arthritic changes. Again, habitual heavy activity levels that we have. This is part of your knee. This is a knee joint of the femur. And again, it's a close-up so that you can really see what arthritis is. This, all these little holes, we call this porosity. And this is because the cartilage that has surrounded this bone in life has started to break down, and you're starting to get some degeneration of the bone underneath it. You can also see it has some of that lipping right here that I talked about before, that new bone development. Again, that's all the process of osteoarthritis. And again, this lets me know, again, also this person was doing something really repetitive and heavy work with their legs to have this state of osteoarthritis that we see. When we look at the overall percentages of osteoarthritis, they are really through the roof, especially because you'll remember when we looked at the age estimations, we had a fair number of relatively young people. When we see young people, we don't usually see a lot of arthritis unless they have some sort of really heavy, habitual, a lot of activity going on. So here we have, 100% of our radiuses had it, over 80% of our ulna, 70% of our humeruses. So our arms, the arms were getting a lot of work. The clavicles, 60% of the clavicles. Our vertebra, over 60% of the backbones had very severe arthritis. So these are pretty heavy arthritis loads for a group of remains that have such a large proportion of young individuals. So that's a big clue as to activity. Okay, so next let's talk about who, when, what type of people were used for the anatomy classes at the University of Utah. So what we did was we were able to go through the death certificates from the time. I went through about 30 years worth of death certificates and look for individuals who actually had University of Utah or Utah Medical School listed as their place of disposition. So, like the law said, these are unclaimed individuals. For the most part, these were individuals where they had no known next of kin. Some of these people they knew very little about. Some they knew a little bit more, but most of them there was no known next of kin to claim them. There were a few that the next of kin did not claim. These were mostly, interestingly enough, individuals who died of alcohol or drug abuse or suicide. Their families did not claim them. I thought that was very interesting. Like I said, I went through about 30 years, give or take, from about 1907 to 1933 to cover the years that we thought that these remains were most likely from. I couldn't do before 1907 because they were not listed on the death certificates or in the death records as going up to the University of Utah. So let's talk about what we had. So interestingly, of all of those years, 92% of the people who went up there were male. Only 8% were female. So they weren't taking a lot of males. A lot of females. They were taking mostly males, which is pretty standard, I think, for the time. There was a real focus on, it was mostly male doctors, and there wasn't a real emphasis on female, and the need to know the differences between males and females at the time. So mostly males. If you look at the age at death of them, the majority, 53%, were of older individuals, 46 plus years. 40%, still a very good large portion, were those younger adults, 23 to 45. 3% were these 15 to 22-year-olds, so very small percent. And then there were 4% that were infants. Starting in the mid 1920s, they started taking stillbirths. And these were in babies that were usually preterm, 5, 6, 7 months gestation, that were born as stillbirths, and they took them. And we have those noted down there as well. So when we look at ancestries of these individuals, not surprisingly, for the area, for the time, the vast majority of these individuals were what we would call white or European ancestry. There were 7% Hispanic. Most of them were listed as Mexican, and most of them had their place of birth as listed as Mexico. There were 3% that were Black individuals, African American individuals, and then there were a couple. There was one Asian, one Native American, and one Filipino, but they weren't large enough numbers they were less than even a full percent to put on there. But so the vast majority were European or white ancestry. Interesting, when you look at the place of birth of these individuals, for a large part, 37%, we didn't know. They didn't know where they were born. But 38% were foreign born. They knew that they were born in another country, and only 25% of those were born in the U.S. When we look at occupation of these people, So for a large proportion, almost 30%, they did not know their occupation. Um, but if you look at the next two most common occupations, laborer or day laborer or common laborer was seen a lot for 22% of these people. The next one was mining, being a miner or a mucker in a mine or a laborer in a mine, was for 20% of these people. And if you look at all of these occupations, you can divide them up into a more physical occupation where they're physically working with their body, and a more not so physical occupation where they're doing more sedentary work. And when you divide the occupations up like that, you still have the percentage that's unknown, but 50% of these people were in what an occupation or doing habitual work that what I would consider physical labor. So that's a very interesting clue. It matches very well what our skeletal remains show. I from looking at the rates of osteoarthritis and trauma on them, I had estimated that yes, they were in fact working with their body a lot, and the death certificate data show that, which is very interesting. So now we can start to compare them even a little bit more. So we know from our skeletal remains that we had at least one subadult, that 15 to 22-year-old group. So maybe if we know that, we can start getting to what actually years these could have come from. So that one male was the key for this. And so if we look through all of our data and we look at individuals who are in that age range, that 15 to 22-year age range, we have 5 individuals that were known to be medical school anatomical cadavers that were taken up. If you look, you'll notice that one of them from 1910, Emma Saylor, is a female. And I know from that phenomenon that we're dealing with a young male, so we can take that one out. So then we have 4 years. We have 1919, 1920, 1923, and 1924 that we know there was a young, skeletally immature male that was taken and was used. And so we have their names. We have their names listed here, which I think is amazing. For me, it's so rare to be able to get names with the people that I analyze, especially historic individuals. So we could possibly try and figure out exactly who this person was. We haven't been able to do that yet, but we are planning to as soon as we can get back into our building. So let's see if we can figure it down even to maybe even more. So we have the 4 years that we know we had a male at the right age taken. We know we have an MNI from our skeletal collection of 11. So we have at least 11 people there. The total numbers taken in those years all are over 11, so that's good. In 1919, it was 17. In 1920, there was 12. In 1913, there was, in 1923, there was 13. And in 1924, there were 12. Then we can look at the sexes that were taken, because we know that we had mostly males, or if not all males, in our skeletal collection. So if you look at the percentages, we have very few females taken those years. In 1919, there was one female. She was a younger adult. She was about 30 years old. In 1920, we had another younger adult female in her mid-30s. In 1923, we had 2 females. One was a younger adult, one was an older adult that was used. And then in 1924, the female that was taken was a stillborn infant. They didn't say what the estimated gestation was, but they just said it was a stillborn infant. So we know there were no skeletally mature, full-grown females that year that were taken. And if you look to see the number of males that were taken, it's right around 11, which is what our MNI is. We didn't have any infant remains in these bones, but that's not concerning to me, because the way they would have treated stillborn infants would have been slightly different. They probably wouldn't have done the embalming the way they would have done with the adults. They would have placed the infant in a very large specimen jar and filled it up with formaldehyde or whatever preservant they were using, and kept it in there and let the liquid just absorb into the infant and then take it out when they were studying it, and then kept it back in there. So the fact that we didn't have any infant remains doesn't concern me very much, but it makes me feel that 1924 might be a very promising year for us to dig into a little bit more to see if we can match some of the remains that we have and the pathological or anatomical features that they have with the known individuals from 1924 that we have. So, in summary, from the skeletal remains that that were inadvertently unearthed and we analyzed, we know that they were anatomical specimens. We know that they were all probably male. We also know that there was at least one 15 to 22-year-old. And we also know that they exhibit a suite of antemortem before death pathologies and traumas that suggest that these individuals were hard workers or of the lower socioeconomic classes, that they had to do more physical work for their jobs. They weren't the banker or the lawyer of the time. We also know that, again, because of that high prevalence of degenerative joint disease, or DJD, that it's clearly, even in the present, clearly the younger individuals, that these individuals were subject to very extreme mechanical loading. Again, very heavy physical labor that they were putting their skeletons under. And this matches what we see in the death certificates quite nicely. So from the death certificates, we looked at the death certificates from 1907 to 1931. And what we saw was that, again, they're mostly male. They are taking mostly males. And so that fits our skeletal remains really nicely. We also see that at least 50% of them had a physical occupation, something that would put a lot of that mechanical loading and that stress on their bodies that we see on those bones. We also see that there were only 5 years in which there was someone in the younger subadult age range of 15 to 22 that were taken. 1 year it was a female, so we can discount that. The other 4 had males in them. I'm thinking 1924 is a good point, but we're going to look through all of those 4 years to see if we can try and pinpoint the exact year that these came from. Like I said, we were able to narrow it down to those 4 years. I like 1924 because of the fact that there were no known females that were taken that year. And finally, this anatomical collection is such an important and a unique snapshot that we get into the lives of these individuals by looking at their bones and even studying their death certificates. There's not a lot known about the types of people that were used early on in medical anatomical studies. Early on, it was done kind of hush-hush. It was kind of done in a way that a lot of people they didn't want a lot of people to know about. And so it's interesting to be able to tell the stories of these people that were used. They've played such an important role to our early medical education here. And now we're being able to tell their stories and to be able to learn a little bit more about them. And I just think that is so important and so unique for us to be able to learn about them. I want to thank you for joining me, and I hope you found this interesting. And there's lots more to come, I'm sure, because there's lots more of from information from the death certificates that I can get out. So in the future, there might be another one of these presentations, part 2 of it. So thank you so much.